everybody. Welcome to my presentation. My presentation is entitled Superhero Justice, the Power of Our Paragons to Inspire a More Dynamic Discourse. And this presentation is going to be talking about my experiences researching the stories we tell each other about through superhero stories as a culture and comparing that to the justice we practice in the real world to protect our citizens and strengthen our society. And so we're going to start off with a classic image here. I'm sure it'll channel a lot of memories you have from comics and cartoons and so forth of Batman hanging the Riddler upside down to get the information he needs. You know, he does that a lot. Poor Riddler. And Batman is just one of many superheroes that we're just surrounded with now. These are movie posters from every single superhero movie based off of a comic book since the big Marvel boom started with Iron Man in 2008. And technically, if you notice Green Hornet there, he started as a radio show, but he has enough comics history now to warrant being up there. So we're surrounded by superhero movies. And this year, 5 out of 10 of the top grossing films of 2016 are superhero movies. We have Captain America Civil War, Batman Superman, Deadpool, Suicide Squad, and X-Men Apocalypse. And out of 8 movies so far this year, they make up about 20% of the global film market. And meanwhile, in comics, sales and the amount of comic books made haven't really changed much over the years. So most of the superheroes that we're surrounded with are from the film world, the films that were inspired by the comics. So what are superheroes about? They're about justice, right? They're about protecting people, going out, getting the bad guy, saving the day. And what kind of justice do we normally see in superhero films? We see subduing. So we have Batman from the film The Dark Knight in 2008 going in to capture a mafia boss, and shortly after that, he drops him off a balcony and breaks both of his knees to get the information he needs. We have arrest, and this is before the big superhero boom in 2008, but it's still a classic image, if you can see it, of Spider-Man sticking 2 jewel thieves up in his web for police to come and pick up. And then also a lot of superheroes also kill their villains. That's the villain in Iron Man getting killed at the end of the movie. Spoilers. And these kinds of justice are still around today. In Batman, Superman, Dawn of Justice, we see Batman intimidating Lex Luthor in his jail cell, telling him not to cause any more trouble. We have Zemo in Captain America Civil War getting arrested at the end of the film. And we have the Guardians of the Galaxy killing their villain at the end of the movie also. Now, all these movies have exceptions. Each movie contains capture, arrests, many of them contain kills, and other movies like Suicide Squad are actually about the supervillains after they get captured. So there are exceptions to the rule, but I would say that when I see superhero films, that's the kind of justice I see a lot. And what are the crimes they're fighting? What are they protecting us from? Well, we have the classic world domination. You see Lex Luthor there, very pleased with himself in the Oval Office about the prospect of taking over Australia. We have Avengers Age of Ultron, where the evil robot Ultron picks up a city and attempts to drop it back onto the surface of the planet again like an asteroid to create a mass extinction because he's determined that humans aren't fit enough to live on the planet anymore. We also have robbery. There's a shot from the first Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie where a nice, sweet little old lady gets her purse snatched. And before, of course, Casey Jones and Raphael come in to take care of business. And we also have Batman Begins demonstrating another crime we see a lot of drugs. And in this case, the Scarecrow's weaponized hallucinogens are being smuggled in stuffed animals. And over the years, I've really come to question and think about the reality that we've been presented with in superhero films, and for a variety of reasons. And a few years ago, I read an amazing book by Gail Simone called Wonder Woman: The Circle, and it's now in the library. And it just completely blew me away because she was depicting a form of justice that I hadn't really seen a lot in superhero comics. I don't know if anybody in the audience has heard of restorative justice, but it's a concept of justice that's being used increasingly in the real world, where a mediator sits down with victims of a crime and with offenders to try to heal the pain that's been caused on both sides and try to heal the community and to think about the causes of a crime and not just focus on the symptoms. And here in the circle, for reasons which we'll get into in a few minutes, Wonder Woman, it's a fun superhero story that incorporates those themes. Outside of work, I write about film and comics, and one of the websites I write for, Sequart Organization, I haven't written on their website in a while, but they are a website dedicated to the academic discussion of comics. And so I ran an article idea by them. Hey, what do you think about this article? Can the U.S. justice system be more like Wonder Woman? And they were like, sure. So I did a short three-part article, not peer-reviewed or anything like that. But I interviewed someone I know who works in the justice system, somebody I know who's a police officer, and a journalist that I know, to get their ideas about can the U.S. be more like Wonder Woman and how they approach justice. And while I was doing that, I thought, well, this is so much of a bigger topic than just like a little three-part article series. And I ran a book idea by them because this is a concept that I don't hear a lot when I talk to friends of mine who are fans or when I'm online and looking at a superhero website. I don't usually hear about justice that much. It's usually like, oh, this is really cool, sweet, look at that shot. Oh, this reminds me of that time when Hawkeye shot Ant-Man up on his arrow and stuff. And I don't hear a lot about the justice part. So I was like, let's do a book about superhero justice. And they were very enthusiastic about that. So we gathered a group of Sequart writers from around the world, like several different countries, to take on different angles, things that they were interested about in superhero justice, and choosing different characters, different points of view on like both sides of the aisle of things. And the book is going to be coming out hopefully in a few months. We'll see. It's a very small organization. This is by no means a major publication. But the book is going to be called Humans and Paragons, Essays on Superhero Justice. And that's one possible cover for it that I personally really like, but we'll see if that turns out to be the cover. And while we were putting the book together, over the last few years, we've been seeing more and more on the headlines of people talking about our justice system. We've seen a lot of African Americans get shot many times on people's phones. We've seen protests. A lot of people are talking about these things. And I think that with the popularity of superhero films, while we're also having this discussion as a nation at the same time, I think this really gives us an opportunity like we haven't really had one in a long while to really think about the stories that we tell each other and what that reinforces to us as a culture, and how can we tell better stories to be more productive in our society. So, justice in real life. I did a lot of research. I read about 24 peer-reviewed articles. I read through some books. And this is what I found when I was researching justice in real life. And that's the Allegheny County Jail in Pittsburgh. So, according to one researcher, the incarceration rate from the 1920s to the 70s was about 110 people per 100,000 inmates. And then in 2008, it jumped up to 504. So the U.S. is at the top with 2.2 million. We're above China, we're way above Russia, and we're way above Iran. And if we want to look at statistics closer to home, from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, in 2014 they have us at about 1,508,000 people that we imprisoned. And since 2004, the numbers have fluctuated a little bit, but that's where they had us in 2014. So who are we locking up? Are we locking up the kingpins of the world? The kingpin, for those of you who don't know, he's a villain in the Marvel universe. He runs most of the organized crime in New York City, and arguably some other places as well. And then, or are we locking up the Joker? There he is pretending to steal Harvey Dent's Christmas tree. I emphasize pretend. It's part of the story. But Are we locking up people like the Joker who are just completely so far gone and beyond redemption, and every chance they get, they're just going to kill as many people as possible? No, not really. Most of the people that we incarcerate are for drug offenses, like low-level drug offenses. So not like mafia kingpins and things like that. And as of September 30th, 2014, 50% of males imprisoned in federal prison and 59% of females were serving time for drug offenses. So why this focus on drugs? Well, it's not the crime rate, according to many articles that I looked at. The crime rate and the imprisonment rate don't seem to be going hand in hand. One study in Seattle found that when it was researching law enforcement with crack cocaine, they weren't able to determine the focus on crack based on prevalence among drug dealers, association with violence, being a public health issue, or legal incentives. And in this country, we have a great deal of racial disparity in our justice system. In September 2014, out of all the inmates in federal prison, 27% were white, 37% were black, and 33% were Hispanic. And drug crimes account for 50% of those crimes. And out of those, 40% of criminals were white, 53% were black, and 57% were Hispanic. And that seems pretty even. But when you look at the population, white people in the US make up about 77%. Black or African American make up about 13%. And Hispanic or Latino are at 17%. Here's a quote: "Although there is a serious drug problem in urban minority communities, the problem also exists in every other community." I thought that was well put. For instance, there was research done on women a few years ago where they found that women in suburban communities and women in urban communities experienced a similar process when going from like why they start taking drugs and then getting addicted to drugs, at least when it comes to drinking and heroin and crack. And there was a national study done and actually found, I was very surprised to hear this based on what I see in media, that white youth were found to do cocaine 4.6 times more than African American youth, crack 1.5 times more, marijuana 46% times more, and selling, they were 1/3 more likely. And in Illinois, in the 80s, they implemented some drug transfer laws, meanwhile, where if you were over 15 years old, and you were caught doing something with drugs within 1,000 feet of a school or public housing, then you were automatically tried as an adult. And minority youth wound up taking up 99% of youth that were being tried as adults. And Seattle found that most crack arrests were outside as opposed to inside. And most of the time when they did a buy bust outside, a buy bust is when you're an undercover police officer pretending to buy drugs, and then they catch you doing that. When they were doing buy busts outside during this study, researchers found that most of the people outside were black, and when they did search warrant arrests inside, they found that most of the people who were committing drug crimes were white. And so buy busts yielded an average of 0.1 gram of narcotics, and inside they found an average of 52 grams of illegal drugs. And over the course of this study, they found 52 weapons inside and 2 weapons outside during the course of these arrests. Whereas in the suburbs, you generally think of a drug problem as something that dealt with through treatment and rehabilitation. And sometimes I even read maturation. So I guess it's like, oh, kids will be kids kind of a thing. That's what I gleaned from that. But yeah. So what we're doing, at least when it comes to drug crimes, are making things worse because they don't address the underlying causes of incarceration Incarceration doesn't address the causes of drug crimes, which are like poverty and addiction. And the parole process has also become extremely difficult. I've seen several researchers that said that there are actually a lot of people that are really trying to do better, but the process is more and more difficult. I'll jump ahead for a second. like in the 90s, there were federal laws. I don't know if they're still in effect or not, but in the 90s, there have been laws where if you have been convicted of a drug crime, you couldn't get welfare or food stamps, public housing, or student loans. And you can think of that in a way like, oh, well, it's because they're not entitled. But it's like, if you're coming out of prison, what's your network like? Do people want to associate with you and that sort of thing? Are you able to afford the housing in the area where you're allowed to live and things like that? And another thing is, like with the cost, and as of 2001 anyway, this study found that detaining a youth in New York City for a day costs 15 times more than putting them in a detention alternative program. And other researchers have found that correctional funds come at the expense of like education and healthcare and other programs. And our country has a history of these kinds of laws. I'm going to read this quote. "It was not, however, the drug addiction of veterans which was quietly accepted, but racist disdain that led to the first American anti-opium law, the 1875 San Francisco Municipal Ordinance outlawing opium dens. It has been persuasively argued that these municipal provisions were part of an overall persecution of the Chinese population in Northern California. The Chinese were welcomed during the gold rush, and once open plot gold exploitation became less lucrative and gold diggers congregated in the cities, Chinese in the labor market were transformed from useful assistants to competitors and subsequently diabolized." And also the Seattle study that I was talking about argued something similar to that. Like the historical record suggests that punitive anti-drug efforts are often triggered by sudden upsurges in the concern about the use of consciousness-altering substances by members of a racially or ethnically stigmatized group. So there are better ways of doing things in what I've read that, at least as far as drugs go, that can address things better. And in ways that really supervise the person to try to get rehabilitated, and they're also more cost effective. Granted, I haven't read anything where it's 100% effective, but according to one article I read as of 2008, incarcerating 80% of non-serious, non-sexual offenders costs $12.9 billion, but these alternatives, they argued, would be $3.2 billion. And they mentioned electronic monitoring, reporting programs where you can either get counseling during the day and go home at night, where it's a very strict schedule, or you can work during the day or go to prison at night. And there's also drug courts, which are sort of a combination of going to court and having like rehabilitation programs and counseling and stuff for as far as drug crimes go. And so what I found in my research is I couldn't find a reason why we do things the way that we do. The only motivation I found was in what many researchers have said, is that the war on drugs, which has created a lot of the laws that we've been dealing with since the 80s. We've had a few, I think, war on drugs, but the main one since the 80s. A lot of people have argued that it's politically motivated to get votes. Like there wasn't really, for instance, there was a study in Texas where the crime rates and the public desire didn't really match the tough on drugs policy, but some politicians really wanted to get more power, so they really did a beefed up media campaign. And that's when Lex Luthor ran for president, by the way. But I'm not calling politicians Lex Luthor. I just thought that was the closest thing from comics I could find. I'm going to read an excerpt from my introduction of the book. "It would seem that we live in a world more overseen by Lex Luthor or Bolivar Trask than defended by Superman or the X-Men. Experts still have much to do in determining the most accurate ways to measure and diagnose research results. But even so, many strategies have been found in the meantime to be far more effective at stopping crime, decreasing recidivism, which means when you go back for the same thing, and relieving burdens on citizens' wallets, especially concerning offenders incarcerated for drug-related crimes. We're not solving our problems with our current courses of action, and yet so much energy is put into the current system between politicians, law enforcement officials, business leaders, journalists, and storytellers of overt fiction, like comics. This is the world we live in. Yet, as much as the war on drugs came from public relations teams, it and its cultural origins have been reinforced by citizens of all walks of life and professions. How we see our world is a crucial part of how we manage it, from policies to what we say, to what we don't say, to what we ignore, to how we are entertained. Perception affects so much. Bush-Biscuit even points out that the use of drugs often leads to the psychological, social, and cultural experience of stigmatization and negative influence that can exacerbate drug use. So the more negatively you're perceived, the more it might give you more of an excuse to keep doing it. And what is unsaid in legal proceedings is just as critical in analyzing the justice system as the rhetoric. To progress what we do, we must not only notice, but continually assess, and to do that includes looking at the assumptions around our words, what we tell each other, what media reinforces, and what it refuses to show. Superhero comics are part of these perceptions. DeMarco argues the following about both ideals and fiction. Insofar as ideals may help to guide conduct and to develop institutions, clarifying moral ideals and moral exemplars is a helpful way to strengthen moral decision-making. Folk heroes, religious figures, and literary creations are commonly used to promote moral behavior by presenting moral exemplars and moral heroes. So superheroes are a big part of what we say about justice in our culture. And the book that I've been working on for most of 2015 is an effort to bring justice more into the conversation of superhero conversation. So in between saying, hey, Black Widow did that sweet move, you can say, well, how effective was it? I mean, not like that. You don't want to ruin all the conversations, but if we can cultivate more of a discussion about superhero justice and think about what we're saying with them. And for the book, I did do 2 interviews for 2 of my comic book heroes. You should look both of them up, Mark Waid and Gerard Jones. Mark Waid said, if you're going to write about superheroes but not make it about justice, then why are you writing superheroes? Because it's part of it. So this book is an effort to sort of keep that alive. And I'll show you I'll talk about a few of the chapters in the book. One of the chapters argues that comics have actually addressed social issues in more complex ways over time than mainstream political rhetoric, which is really like black and white, us versus them kind of a thing. And to illustrate that, there's an image of the issue where it's revealed that Magneto, the X-Men's greatest foe, actually was a child in Auschwitz during the Holocaust. So he's a villain, but he has these more complex motivations that were introduced. And also, there's a chapter analyzing the Ninja Turtles. Here's a page from their first issue where they kill the Shredder. You might not know that they killed the Shredder the very first time they met him, unless you count Raphael, who delivered a letter earlier. But this chapter thinks about what drives the Ninja Turtles. What do they fight for, other than saving the world? What's their purpose in life? Another chapter argues that if superheroes were real, they would probably have a similar experience to Peter Parker, like in this comic of Spider-Man, where he saves the day and then he gets home only to see in the newspaper that they are calling for his arrest. Well, the newspapers want him to be arrested. And a lot of superheroes in real life would probably experience that because, they're wearing masks, they can't be held accountable, they might not be going about things the most efficient ways. There's another chapter that analyzes the Joker from a psychological perspective, like could he really exist? And here's an issue where the Joker thinks that he killed Batman and he becomes a normal person, he even gets engaged, but then he finds out that Batman's still alive and then things go downhill from there. We also have a chapter that analyzes Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy, the Dark Knight trilogy, from the perspective of how does the secret identity or the concept of the noble lie, where you tell a lie for good reasons, how does that come into effect when you're dealing with institutions of justice? We have another essay that talks about quote-unquote dark superhero stories in which characters have to face really, really serious issues. Sometimes people are like, well, that's a downer. But this author argues that that's very important when we think about our world. And to illustrate that, the author uses her own experience fighting breast cancer, as well as using examples from Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, and Susan B. Anthony about literature that inspired them to fight the adversity they were fighting. And that's an example from the show Arrow. A lot of people like to hate on the Laurel Lance character, but that's an image where she overcomes her alcohol addiction, because she's sort of seen as a downer by many people on the internet in the show. But in this chapter, the author really appreciates her as a character. And then my chapter is called Honing Our Senses, Remembering the Vibrancy of Superhero Justice. And we're going to start with a quick clip of Superman. It's a reference to Superman. So that's a reference to Superman. Superman can pretty much hear everything at once. And he constantly has to sort through all the cacophony around him to focus in on the best information he can use to help people. And we have to actually, a lot of us have experiences similar to Superman. We're surrounded by different kinds of media. We see a lot of things depicted in movies and newspapers, on television. We see so much in the world around us, and it's easy to forget all the little bits of information that might not make it to the surface. And when I was doing research on comics, I found that there's an incredible amount of stories, superhero stories, that explore justice in really nuanced ways. And I wanted to share a few of them with you that I mentioned in the essay today. Like I mentioned Wonder Woman earlier with restorative justice. So in this part of the circle, she gets attacked by some super intelligent gorillas. And while she's fighting them, she gleans bits of information from them about while they're there in between their various insults. And when she wins the fight, she determines they were sent under false pretenses, and she vows to actually help them to sort out the situation, because she doesn't just look at the symptoms of a crime. She wants to go and find out the root causes of it and try to make things better. She also helps a group of conquering aliens, who are like some bad guys in the DC world, and they are being systematically destroyed. So she decides to help them, and she finds out the person causing it is a superhero, a Green Lantern, and because they killed his family, because those aliens that are experiencing genocide, they were doing the same to his family. And she is able to reach him at the end by saying, if loss makes you doubt your belief in justice, then you never truly believed in justice at all. And she really does some really heavy stuff. Like, there's an issue where she fights a neo-Nazi who's trying to kill her. So not only do you have the ultimate kind of villain, but she's dealing with a life-threatening situation, and she does something that really incredible that not a lot of people can do. She puts him in her lasso of truth, which first of all is very handy. We don't have that in real life, where it not only makes the villain tell the truth, but it makes them see the truth about themselves. And so she uses that to say, I follow the Amazon code when facing a vanquished foe. Punishment for the adult, empathy for the child, even for him. And that was huge to me. That really shocked me when I read that. Another really interesting hero is the Martian Manhunter. He was a Martian who accidentally gets sent to Earth by a beam. It's a long story. And he's a very interesting character because he's an alien, and so he's a people watcher. He likes to think about why we do what we do. And in this story, Martian Manhunter, American Secrets, he stumbles upon an alien plot to make humans conform to the aliens via media control. And to be able to analyze your culture, you need to be able to find the seams and see how it works. Because what I said earlier, what we don't say in our culture is as important as what we do say. So that's a really interesting story. And by the way, these are very fun stories to read. It's not like me standing up here at the podium telling you things. They're superheroes doing really fun things in visually interesting ways. but they also incorporate these ideas. This is a panel from a recent She-Hulk story where she says most of lawyering is conversations, and her client's like, well, what's the other part of it? And she's like, beating up robots. And that pretty much sums up most of what that series is like. She-Hulk is also a lawyer, and these stories, they take legal concepts and they turn them into fun little stories. Like in this one, she's dealing with patent law issues and working through the legal department. There's another one where she tries to help Dr. Doom's son get asylum. And so they're like fun stories, but they incorporate these other concepts. There's another really great X-Men story that really showcases something you don't see a lot. Normally in comics, police, they're sort of like the dumbfounded ones with their guns when like Spider-Man ties up the jewel thieves. But in this story called God Loves, Man Kills, and let me back up for a second. For those of you who aren't familiar with the X-Men, they are a group of people who are stigmatized because they're born with these extra abilities. And so in this story, there is a televangelist who is actually trying to kill mutants on the side. And when he tries to kill the X-Men in front of a group of followers at Madison Square Garden, yeah, true story. The police step in, they incapacitate the televangelist by shooting him in the leg or something, and they keep everybody else back. And they use training and logic to resolve the situation and protect everybody, including the X-Men who are stigmatized. And by doing that, you integrate them further into society. And it's also really powerful because it puts it in their point of view. So it's like they're saving the day. You feel that these are real people doing a very difficult job. And it just reminded me anyway. This is like the most powerful reminder for me that they just need, that police, they are a crucial institution. They need the training, support, and resources that anybody else would need. And I think that's a really powerful reminder. And I don't think that police should be like depicted as, okay, take them away. Well, gee, thanks, Spider-Man. I think it's better when they're integrated in a more thoughtful way. Also, Green Hornet, there's a great example. For those of you not familiar with Green Hornet, he and his associate Kato, they take down crime by pretending to be criminals. And they also have a go-to info person named Lenore Case, who is also a librarian. And at the end of this story, being Green Hornet is taking a real toll on him, and he doesn't want to do it anymore. He's been doing a lot of shaping with the criminal underworld and making things how he wants, and he's like, I'm done with it. I can't do it anymore. And Lenore gets herself arrested so she can give him information on the inside and say, no, you can't create a world and then walk away from it because it hurts you. You're as much a part of the world as everybody else. And that makes, for me, I felt like she was asking me, like, what do I leave up to others and what's up to me? Because, we're all part of the society. We're all responsible for doing our part. And I could talk all day, clearly, about this stuff. Like, there's a Captain America story where the new Captain America has to determine who am I allowed to defend without it being a political issue. There's a Superman story where he defends a low-income neighborhood from some police who are possessed by an alien. There's a story where Batman has to reconsider the effectiveness of his methods. There's a Moon Knight story where a villain has a corrupt parole officer. So we have to think about, well, we don't have to think about. I think that we should think about what do we want our stories to do when we tell them. And to conclude, I'm going to read a piece from my essay in the book. It's called this section's called The Better Vision. When this chapter was written, the most recent superhero theatrical release was Avengers: Age of Ultron. Being a Marvel movie, it was particularly indicative of mainstream superhero culture at that point in time. It includes great commentary about the status quo, the perpetuity of war, the corruption of officials, and the extension of structures beyond nations. The film also demonstrated that S.H.I.E.L.D., a spy agency, can protect, and that the Avengers must reconsider their place in the world. However, the film ultimately sidesteps everything it sets up, keeping itself, as Bruce Banner acknowledges, in a time loop. Tony Stark is depicted as being wrong to bring about artificial intelligence until he isn't. Conveniently, not only can the Avengers ask the Vision, he's an android, depicted as a deterrent of higher understanding if he is on their side, but this deterrent is also worthy of Thor's magical hammer, which not everybody can pick up. This is like asking the atomic bomb its opinion before using it to win World War II. The Vision actually does in fact serve as the ultimate vision, the self-fulfilling prophecy that Western culture creates for itself. For the film ends with the Vision acknowledging to Ultron, the evil robot, that humanity is doomed, reinforcing an earlier line about the end times. And then the Vision kills Ultron. From the Ralph Wolf and Sam Sheepdog nature of the film's combat, to the cliched character roles of Hawkeye's family, to the end credits fetishization of the Avengers in a Marvel statue invoking Greek mythology, Avengers: Age of Ultron is a reinforcement of what Western culture has told itself for thousands of years. Luckily, responses to the film have been increasingly mixed. This, however, needs to be cultivated. The more representative ideas in superhero comics need to take hold and grow in mainstream discourse. Progression is a balance between listening to others and remembering what we know, analyzing the best information possible to make our own honest decisions, and never taking any worldviews for granted. While considering superhero justice, it is crucial to remember that as much as superhero media and discourse have kept the nuances of justice in the background, the superhero comics at the heart of it all have continued to live up to their namesakes and used their expansive universes to explore justice in incredible ways, strengthening their foregrounds with informed backgrounds, informing their fantasies with larger questions and verified facts of life rather than perpetuations of ignorance. Superhero comics are part of the realities we construct. When a culture sanctions something, it gives it weight, and what we tell each other can change laws. The last few thousand years may have been just fine for some people, but as the mainstream is confronting more and more in today's headlines, it certainly has been far less for most. Don't listen to the Vision. Be self-aware. Keep your experiences with you. Build. Inspire interests, professions, research, activism, and policy. To borrow from Charles Xavier in the film X-Men: Days of Future Past, if we allow ourselves to feel and embrace all of what superhero comics have to offer, we can make the discourse better. Channel Superman. Hone your own senses and fill in those gaps. Otherwise, no one else will. Thank you. And does anybody have any questions or thoughts or comments? Yes.
Would you say that virtually all, or do you have a specific percentage of superhero comments that you think are about the issues of justice?
I didn't measure that, but there's quite a few. I have like a much longer list. Yeah, and it's not about the characters, it's about what we say about them. Like Batman and Superman do really interesting things, but they also do really simple things. So
My follow-up question was, it seems clear that the writers of the comics, or the creators of the comics,
yeah.
They want issues of justice to be considered. I mean, it's essential to what they're trying to accomplish.
Mm-hmm.
And from your perspective, what percentage of the actual audience considers issues of justice while reading them?
Well, most people, I didn't measure that either, but most people I talk to, they generally find it as interesting as other parts of the conversation. And writers are very interested in it. But as one writer told me, you're in somebody else's sandbox playing with somebody else's toys, and it's a big company, and they don't want to rock the boat too much all the time. But it is on people's minds, and I think that people generally find it interesting.
The reason I asked that question, I thought was just hoping from your perspective that these issues of justice don't add to a lot of the readers.
Yeah, well, I don't hear about it that much. That's the thing. Like the word I hear most often when people talk about a superhero movie, pardon my French, is badass. That's what I hear the most. It's like a buzzword now in Hollywood. People just use it all the time. Any other questions, thoughts, comments? Mm-hmm.
that sort of stuff. So given that reality in this ideal world, why do you think we're drawn to that? If our reality is people are arrested for all these drug crimes, and
Yeah.
that comic book characters are solving big issues.
Well, part of it is with bigger things. It's easy, like it's a good feeling, right? When you see a superhero go and save the world, and it actually, I think it does stem from when we're children. I read one book that talks about why superheroes are needed, because it really helps children feel empowered and think about what's right and what's wrong, and so stories, they have a good feeling with us when somebody's going to go rob a bank and then Spider-Man stops them and puts them up in his web. I think it's a good feeling, and I think part of it also stems from sort of antiquated notions of justice, where you lock somebody up and that's it until they escape again in the next episode. But I think that bigger crimes, they're easier to address, and they also have very much an archetypal feeling in us. That's what I think.
Just out of curiosity, did you, by the way, Keith, that's me. Did you read the Calvin and Hobbes series either?
I love Calvin and Hobbes.
He did a series, I can't remember how many days, 4 or 5 I think, in which they addressed some of these things that you're talking about. And the conclusion that Calvin drew at the end was because quick to the bat facts doesn't have the same sort of dramatic appeal that quick to the Batmobile does.
Oh yeah, and that's a really good point. One of the writers I interviewed, when I said, "Why do you think Wonder Woman hasn't caught on?" he said, "Because it's not fun to draw." And he said, that sounds like a glib answer, but really, you don't want to see somebody talking in a courtroom all day.
Right, let's organize.
Yeah, yeah, montage, right? Yeah, yeah, working through the permits. But I think that there are a lot of superhero stories. I think it's easier than people would think it is to do that. But that is a really good point, and Bill Watterson is a genius. Yes. Yes.
What is your take on Deadpool?
Deadpool is great because while I don't personally read Deadpool, I very much appreciate the meta-ness of it all. Because Deadpool, for those of you who don't know, he knows that he's a comic book character. So, like, he'll be talking to the reader, and another character will be like, What? Who are you talking to? What's going on? And Deadpool's like, don't worry about it, but you know. And in the movie, he also knows that he's a movie character too. So that helps you consider it as a genre. So I think I highly support Deadpool, even though I don't always read or watch. I love meta stuff. So. And one thing that I like to ask students is, if you put 2 Deadpool comics facing each other, is that infinite perception? Anyway. Yes.
So I grew up with comics. I wonder whether you think over years things have changed, or as a child, it seemed to me there was good and bad. And to a great extent, superheroes seem to portray sort of black and white.
Mm-hmm.
But in more recent years, I feel like you're getting more depth in characterization. And so that maybe there are more shades of gray in that.
Absolutely.
But whether a young audience can always pick that up is an argument.
And that's always an issue too, is like when a little kid wants to read a comic book, do you say, well, this is actually how the justice system works, you know? But my rebuttal to that is we want to portray people accurately, right? We don't want to watch a movie in the jungle and you hear a kookaburra like in those old movies. I don't know if anybody knows what a kookaburra is, like the wah sound when people were in a jungle. Kookaburras they live in Australia, so we want the world to be portrayed in an accurate way, and I think that we can do that in subtle ways without like hitting people over the head with a message. And it's also an issue of it's big in comics right now. Are there still comics for kids? Like, because all the fans are now like grown up and they want to see their heroes taken more seriously. So there's a balance there too, definitely. Okay, well, feel free to talk to me about this anytime, really. And yeah.